I'm Marc Rotterman. Coming up, we'll talk with Congressman Patrick McHenry. Next.
Major funding for Front Row is provided by Robert L. Luddy, with additional funding provided by funding for the lightning round provided by RIFENBURG Construction and Jane and Van HIPP. A complete list of funders can be found at unctv.org/frontrow. It's Front Row with host Marc Rotterman.
Welcome back. Thanks for joining us, Congressman. Appreciate you coming
Great to
by.
be with you.
How's your family doing? How are they adapting to this crisis and the COVID-19?
Well, the 5-year-old and 2-year-old are doing well. They see a lot of Nana in the house and mommy and daddy, but my wife and I are both working full time, so it's a bit of a juggle to homeschool and keep them going. But we're all adapting to that, and I think we're all having a great appreciation for the needs of our kids in a time like this, for sure.
The president issued new guidelines this week. Can you tell us a little bit about those, and when do you think the economy will reopen? Will it be in stages?
Well, I think that is what the outline is about. When we hit certain metrics, we should be able to open. And that's really the mentality of underlying what the White House outlined. This is really about each individual state and locality making those decisions for their public health. The fact is that we have a large swath of the country that has been minimally affected by this COVID-19 outbreak. But the areas that have been very hard hit are experiencing pretty close to overload of their healthcare system. What we don't want is for the areas that are experiencing a light response to actually have something ignite in a greater fashion. And these are very complicated things. They're not just simple math that we learn in school. It's a little more complicated to predict the outbreak and the spread of a virus like this. But the key thing is here that we need to have public metrics that we can measure ourselves against, that states should be able to measure themselves against, and governors and localities can make the decisions about when to reopen and how to reopen. So I think we'll see a phased reopening in the coming weeks. In the worst affected areas, it may be a month or two.
You were recently on a conference call with the president. Can you tell us about that, sir?
Well, the president has outlined the president has outlined a number of councils from the White House and advisory panels on reopening our economic life. I was grateful to be a part of a bipartisan group of legislators that are part of advising the president on our economic recovery. Look, the CARES Act was about getting us through and bridging us through the shutdown of our economy. And now what we need is the thought process on the type of changes we need to make to public policy to help reignite this economy. We had a strong economy coming into this year. We will have a strong economy after we come out of lockdown, but there are going to be some glitches, and we want to make sure that we minimize those glitches so we can get back to normal economic life and people can go back about their normal work as Americans, as families, and our communities. And so I'm happy to be part of that bipartisan group to advise the president on some of those necessary changes to get our economic life back up and rolling and for us to have a strong economy once again.
You just mentioned glitches. How is the process working for these SBA loans? Are the community banks doing a better job, Congressman?
Yes, I think what we're hearing is the complaints about a very large, complex government program that was implemented very quickly. So I describe it this way: as a Small Business Administration is a very good 1964 Volkswagen Beetle. Very minimal technology and fine to get around town. But what we needed was for that Volkswagen Beetle to fly. And what the Treasury Department did, and a number of interventions from a lot of us, is to bolt on, to duct tape that Volkswagen Beetle so it can go 1,000,000 miles an hour. So let me just tell you a couple stats. So the SBA lent more in the last 14 days than it did in the last 14 years. So there are going to be some glitches when you see that volume difference. And what we see is it's largely working, not perfectly, but largely working. And we have now fully extinguished all the funds. So we have $350 billion is now lent to small businesses across the country through community banks and credit unions. And though there are glitches, that money went at an unprecedented fast pace. What we need to do is ensure that funding continues, because there's a great need, a fantastic, major, big need for small businesses to access this money so they can keep their payroll and they can make ends meet as our economy is still shut down. So with all the glitches, with all the faults and failures, we still see that the money went very quickly. That's the reason why I advocated for more funding for this program when we're negotiating the CARES Act. $350 billion I thought was insufficient for the roughly 30 million small businesses across the country. And now that we have about 1.5 million, close to 2 million small businesses access these funds, I'm sure we've got multiples of that are still wanting to access the program.
We're running out of money for that program as we speak, aren't we? Now, there's what, another $250 billion on the table that the president has advocated for?
That's right. And that $250 billion, I think, will go very quickly. I think it'll go in 10 days once Congress allocates the money. This is still caught up in a great deal of partisan haggling. What I think about in the legislative process is reasonable trade-offs. And look, reasonable people can come to terms. But when you get legislative greed, when people think that they have more power than they do, they make for ridiculous asks that are completely unacceptable. And there you have gridlock. Some reasonable asks, sure, you can come to terms. What we had from Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer were quite unreasonable asks. They asked for money for funds that haven't even been extended yet, haven't even been spent at all out of the CARES Act. They wanted more money for the states and for hospitals. Well, those monies are not going to run out, not slated to run out for months now. The PPP program for small businesses, that funding is gone now. And so I think there's a high need for Congress to come to terms here and get things done. And I think in the coming days, we will.
Do you think Congress will come back in session? Currently, you're not in session.
If we agree, we don't all have to be there. That means that you have to work through unanimous consent, and that means we don't all have to be physically in the same room. We can agree that this product is worthy of passage, and therefore no one object. If someone shows up to object, then we've got to have a vote, and it's a formalized process, of course. But there is a way for us to transact business if we all agree. That means cooler heads need to prevail. You got to take off your ideological hat, your partisan hat, and think about the pain the American people are feeling, and get on with the business of making reasonable things occur legislatively. Right now, we have too much legislative greed from a few that are trying to leverage their position for more money for their states or their localities. And I think that's the reason why we've got to kind of push through this thing and get on with it.
We're about 13% unemployment right now. Small businesses, restaurants are really getting hurt. Some projections, 30% unemployment by July. You were involved in the initial $2 trillion rescue package. Do you foresee that we're going to need more stimulus going forward?
Well, let's put that in context. $2 trillion. The federal government, our whole gross domestic product, what we just devoted to the CARES Act, $2.4 trillion, plus the actions of the Federal Reserve as of 2 weeks ago, as of the passage of the CARES Act, that's the equivalent of 20% of the gross domestic product. When you add up what the Federal Reserve has done in the last 2 weeks, that takes it to 30% of our GDP. So we've had a massive intervention in our economy. Of the CARES Act, we've had about $500 billion to $600 billion go out the door already. $500 to $600 billion. we still are. So we're only about a quarter of the way through that funding. So before we devote more funds to this recovery, I want to know how the CARES Act money was spent, whether it was effective. And so what I'm advocating for is for us to measure twice and cut once, rather than throw more money out the door. We've got to be very thoughtful about the approach, aggressive because of the economic needs of the American people, an unprecedented nature of this. This is not the Great Depression. It's not the Great Recession. Those things were caused by financial malfeasance by a few that then foisted upon the American people. Housing in the last financial crisis and complicated financial products, and then the Great Depression, a whole series of things. What we've had is the shutdown of our economy, and the shutdown of our economy to save people's lives for public health. And so it's unprecedented for a business to experience zero revenue for a month, much less 8 weeks. And that's what we're currently going through. So we have to think through methodically about this. Be aggressive, yes, because of the pain of the American people, unprecedented nature of this. But we've got to make sure that we're not just throwing money out the door just to spend money, just so Congress says that we're doing something. Let's make sure it's effective, like this PPP program has been for small business. Let's make sure it's effective before we start shoveling American taxpayer dollars and further indebting the American people. Let's make sure it's right. So I think in time we can have another bill, but I don't think we should do that before these funds have gone out the door for the CARES Act.
Are we providing enough liquidity for the banks? And talk to us about the loans for major companies and the elements of the rescue packages for hospitals as well, too, right?
That's right. That's right. So there's an element of the CARES Act that is devoted to helping states sort of go through the process of revenue dropping off dramatically. The use of the state sales tax, for instance, or different occupancy taxes and everything else to keep municipalities afloat. That's $150 billion. We have additional monies that go to hospitals, large and small. And those monies are going out the door. We have money for telehealth, for instance, that's going out the door as well. But in particular for community banks and large banks, everything in between. We want to make sure that this health crisis, it's become an economic crisis, does not become a financial crisis, which means we've got to be thoughtful about the intervention of federal regulators. So we have more regulatory relief so the banks can put their capital reserves to work to make loans and keep financial products going, making sure people can still get mortgages, still have credit cards work, still have their savings protected. And so we've done those things, and I've worked with federal regulators to make sure that those policies are implemented well and fairly. Meaning, we don't want a bailout of Wall Street here. That's not the intention. The intention is to ensure that our financial products, everyday Americans and businesses, have their finances protected. So the Federal Reserve has done that in addition to the other financial regulators. The Federal Reserve has announced unprecedented programs to backstop a whole variety of financial products. Given how aggressive this economic shutdown has been, they've taken equally aggressive action, and I commend them for that. I think, though I think the central bank, our Federal Reserve, should be the lender of last resort, not just a lender, not just another participant in the marketplace, but provide that buoyance in our marketplace to keep things afloat. They're doing the right thing and acting. The biggest announcement they've made is a Main Street lending program that will take small businesses up to 10,000 employees, so pretty good sized businesses, but not the people that that use Wall Street to fund themselves. So those smaller businesses, given the size of America, those that traditionally get lending through banks, not through Wall Street.
Is that going to community banks? Is that going to community banks? Sorry for interrupting. Is that more going to community banks? Is that the more effective way?
Yes, it's going to be community banks. Well, banks of all sizes, just like with the PPP program, but they're all going to have equal access to this program. It's not going to just be the big banks that are doing this, and I think that's going to be good. the idea here is that these loans will be a little more aggressive than what banks can currently underwrite, given the finances of businesses that have seen their revenue dry up. So there'll be finances for businesses as of the end of 2019. So you bring your 2019 financials, and they'll lend against that rather than your current financials, which we all know just about every business in America, outside of grocery and a few other staples, is really bust right now. And so we want to make sure that people could float through this and get back to economic life once the economy turns back on.
We have 13 million unemployed as we speak. How are those checks getting out to them? And is that going to be an expanded process, an expanded program, so they go longer, maybe more weeks?
So the first tranche of checks have gone out the door, and thankfully they got out the door much more quickly than when we had the economic downturn post 9/11. Congress and President George W. Bush had similar stimulus checks that went out the door. It took the Treasury Department 70 days to send those checks out, which is completely crazy that it would take the federal government that long to write checks. This time around, it took 18 days to get the checks out. So much faster, still not the speed at which I think business operates or technology operates, but much better. And so those checks are going out right now. That's a significant impact for those that are receiving those checks. And I'm already getting texts about people receiving their checks and how appreciative they are. So I think that is a helpful bridge. We also have expanded unemployment benefits so that people can bridge this time as well, with these unprecedented number of folks that are unemployed, over 20 million as of this week unemployed because of the shutdown of our economy.
So I see the Democrats want to expand to $1,200 and have a new program to, what is it, $2,000? Is that correct, sir?
That's right.
So
that's right.
Is that going to be part of another package? What are the prospects for that?
Well, let's see how this performs. Let's make sure that this money is actually getting in people's hands and having the impact that the American people needs, right? And so I think we need to have a measurement tool to make sure that it's actually the best impact we can have to get people back working and make sure they make their mortgage payments and car payments and things of that sort. So I think the contours of the next package we're going to be driven based off the health reality and the economic reality we face in another month or two.
How are independent contractors, Congressman, being handled? How do they sign up to get some help?
Well, for the first time, independent contractors are eligible for unemployment benefits. And I think that is proper given the current nature of our economy, where you have a lot of folks called gig workers doing really important tasks. It's the equivalent of full-time employment. They may just get it through 2 or 3 different means. And so we want to make sure that we take care of them. So they're eligible for unemployment benefits to a certain extent. What I think we also need to do, and what I'm pushing for regulatory changes, is that we need to make sure that these gig workers, these independent contractors, can access healthcare, savings tools, insurance, and even investments opportunities that you would get if you worked in a big company. And I think that makes a lot of sense given the new nature of our economy, where people are putting together 2 and 3 jobs to have full-time or more than full-time in employment. Why should we just let the folks that work full-time at big companies get access to stock grants or the upside growth of these companies? We've got independent contractors that should have that same benefit of investments in those big companies and get that real benefit of linking labor with the capital markets as well, and the upside of our economy and our great American comeback that we'll have when we get back to work.
Patrick, the president favors a tax holiday, a payroll tax holiday. Do you favor that?
I think so. I think that's the fastest relief to the American people. If you're getting a paycheck, let's pause this and not have to remit government money to the government. That would be a direct benefit to every American. I think that is a strong incentive, and something that that was effective when it was done coming out of the Great Recession a decade ago, and I think it would be effective as well
Now, there are penalty-free distributions for people, over 69, 70 on some of their IRAs. How's that going to work?
Yes. So a couple things. We have once you're over a certain age, you have to take minimum withdrawals out of your investment accounts. We've suspended that, and I think that's helpful. And that is saying we don't want you to take your money out of the market when everything is really gone bad. We know this thing's going to come back. We know that the American economy has strength. We just need to get back to it, back to work when it's safe and when it's safe to go back. And so we've given regulatory relief there to say you don't have to take your minimum distribution, and a number of tax changes for individuals and businesses as well.
Are you comfortable? The president just made a deal with the airlines, $25 billion. It's not a bailout, but how is that going to work? Is that a loan, and do they have to pay back the whole loan? And the other thing I understand is that taxpayers may have equity in the airlines. Is that correct?
Yes, and look, I think Secretary Mnuchin and the president are hard drivers when it comes to negotiating, and we've deemed the airlines as essential to our economic life here in the United States, and I get the same shabby treatment everybody else does when we fly on the airlines. But it's essential that we have the air travel that's available to us, and so when we allocated money to ensure that the airlines that are basically running at single-digit capacity right now, instead of running at 95%, 92 to 98% capacity as they have been for the last couple of years, they're running at single-digit capacity. And so what we're trying to do is just keep them afloat for the short period of time. But we also need to say, if they get back and they start earning money, the American taxpayer needs to be paid back in full and then some for saving them. So the taxpayer needs the upside of this as well, not just the private shareholders or the debtors or the union employees of these airlines. And so I think it's a fair bargain. It's aggressive, but it's fair. And if the airlines could get a better deal somewhere else, well, they would have gotten it. So I think that's a pretty reasonable outcome.
The president just halted funding to the World Health Organization. Is that the right thing to do right now? Critics like Bill Gates say this is absolutely the wrong thing to do at this time.
Well, look, the World Health Organization has been an apologist to the Communist Chinese. They have. There's just no getting around it. And they were using Chinese propaganda rather than solid statistics in December, in January, and February. And so I think for the president to say, let's halt this, let's make sure that these people are being honest at the World Health Organization, I think is a thoughtful, smart thing to do. Let's review what our money's going towards. We're not going to, I don't think we should be funding Chinese propaganda. We believe in public health. We believe in data. We don't want to obscure it by having the World Health Organization just parrot what the Chinese are saying.
Okay, in that regard, a quick lightning round. Do we need to rethink our supply chain with China, prescription drugs, antibiotics? Do we need to find different venues to do that, different countries or our own country?
Yes, we need to rethink our supply chains A to Z, from things that are important to our national security, like technology, like military parts, but all the way back to consumer goods that we rely on, and especially pharmaceuticals. We rethought that after World War I and World War II. We're experiencing something similar here, so we need to rethink the fullness of our supply chains. Absolutely.
Any final thoughts in about a minute, sir?
So what I'd tell you is we have to rethink our relationship with government. We know that we have to be resilient and self-reliant as individuals, but we also need a functioning government And we need technology in government that is going to deliver quickly and efficiently when it needs to. So let's update the federal footprint, though limited, and let's make sure we get back to economic life. What I would tell you is our economic system works and is of great value. And this shutdown of our economy is not a failure of capitalism. It is not. This is an act of God. And when there's an act of God, you have to step in and help your fellow man. That's what we do with hurricanes. That's what we do with floods. This is what we do with natural disasters that are outside of our control. And so let's be thoughtful about this. Let's say that our economic system is good, is resilient, and we will be stronger coming out of this as individuals, as families, as communities, and as a people, as an American people. So I'm optimistic. We've got brighter days ahead.
That's a great wrap up, sir. Thanks for being with us. We really appreciate your time. That's it for us. Have a great weekend. See you next week on Front Row.
Major funding for Front Row is provided by Robert L. Luddy, with additional funding provided by funding for the lightning round provided by RIFENBURG Construction and Jane and Van HIPP. A complete list of funders can be found at unctv.org/frontrow. It's Front Row with host Marc Rotterman.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.